The snow had begun at dusk, soft as breath and fine as flour, dusting the roofs of Silverleaf before the lamps were even lit. By nightfall, the whole town lay under a white hush, the kind that seemed to muffle even memory. Main Street stood nearly empty. The mine had closed for the season, and most of the men had gone down valley looking for work that didn't freeze the fingers or break the heart. What few remained huddled in the saloon, nursing coffee thickened with whiskey, waiting for the sound of Christmas bells that would never come. From the sheriff's office, Daniel Harper watched the snow swirl through the lamplight. His desk was cluttered with ledgers, half-filled reports, and one unopened letter from his sister back east. He wasn't in the habit of reading family letters before Christmas. They carried too much pity. He leaned back, boots crossed, hat low over his brow. The stove beside him gave a dull pop, settling. Somewhere outside, a door slammed against the wind. Silverleaf had once been loud, full of men singing as they worked, wagons rattling, women hanging wash from windows. Now it was a place of ghosts. He'd buried most of them himself. A knock came at the door, soft, hesitant. Daniel looked up, expecting trouble. Instead, when he opened the door, he saw Sammy, his 9-year-old nephew, standing in a swirl of snow with a bundle in his arms. "Evenin', Uncle," Sammy said, cheeks red, eyes wide. "Look what I found." Daniel frowned, crouching down. "You been out this late?" "I was at Miss Boone's bringing her firewood like you said, but when I came back—" He unwrapped the bundle, revealing a wooden horse, carefully carved, its legs painted white, its mane gold. Around its neck hung a sprig of pine tied with red ribbon. Daniel blinked. "Where'd you get that?" "It was sitting right on our porch." "Anybody seen leaving it?" Sammy shook his head. "No, sir, just snow. But it's from the angel, ain't it?" Daniel sighed. "We don't know who's leaving those things, boy. Could be anyone." Sammy's grin didn't fade. Then it could be the angel. The child's hope was a fragile thing, glowing like the lantern between them. Daniel didn't have the heart to snuff it out. He took the toy gently, turning it in his hands. The carving was fine, too fine for a miner's work. It had the kind of careful grace that came from someone who knew loneliness. "Go on home, Sammy," he said quietly, "and mind your prayers tonight." "Yes, sir." Sammy tugged his scarf up to his chin and ran through the drifts, vanishing into the white. Daniel stood for a long moment at the doorway, watching the boy's footprints fill with snow until they were gone. Behind him, the lamplight flickered. He set the horse on the desk and leaned back, arms folded, staring at it as though it might explain itself. Outside, the snow kept falling. Somewhere near the edge of town, a candle burned faintly behind a shuttered window, a small, steady flame against the storm. By morning, Silverleaf looked as though the world had been made new. The night storm had buried every path, every scar under a clean white sheet. Even the slag heaps from the old mine glimmered like they'd never known soot or sorrow. But the people inside the houses knew better. Snow didn't heal anything, it only covered it up for a while. Sheriff Daniel Harper hitched his coat tight against the cold and stepped out into Main Street, boots crunching over the frozen crust. A line of chimney smoke leaned sideways in the wind. From the livery stable came the sound of someone chopping wood, rhythmic, dull, resigned. He'd meant to start the day with coffee, but something about that carved horse on his desk had kept him uneasy through the night. He'd dreamed of snow falling through candlelight, of a woman's hands carving small miracles out of silence. He didn't believe in angels, not the kind that left toys for orphans. But someone in Silverleaf did. And if it wasn't charity, then it might be something else entirely. He stopped first at Clara Boone's boarding house, the unofficial heart of the town. The old widow was already on her porch, broom in hand, sweeping away snow that would only fall again within the hour. "Mornin', Sheriff," she called. "If you're here to rent a room, I'm fresh out." He smiled faintly. "Not here for lodgin'. Heard a few of your boarders found gifts outside their doors." Clara leaned on her broom, her eyes sharp as pins. "Aye, that they did. Little parcels wrapped in paper, bread, ribbons, even a tin soldier. Whoever's behind it knows what each soul here's been missin'." "You seen anyone in the night?" "Only the wind." Daniel's gaze swept down the street. "If you believe the stories about this Christmas angel?" Clara's mouth twitched. "I believe grief makes folks see what they need to. If that's an angel, then she's got rough hands and a tired heart." "She." "I said if," Clara teased, eyes narrowing. "Though it's a woman's sort of mercy, don't you think?" He studied her, catching something unspoken in her tone. You got someone in mind? Clara's broom paused mid-sweep. I mind my own sins, Sheriff. You do the same. He tipped his hat. Appreciate the advice. As he walked away, he could feel her eyes on his back, watchful, maybe even protective. At the far end of the street stood Rowan's candle shop, its windows frosted over, curtains drawn. He hadn't seen Maggie Rowan at church in months. Folks said she kept to herself since the mine collapse took her husband and most of her joy with him. Still, smoke rose from her chimney. Daniel hesitated, then mounted the steps. The doorbell gave a small chime as he pushed inside. Warmth and wax filled the air. Shelves lined the walls, filled with candles of every color and size, tapers, lantern lights, small molded stars. The whole place glowed like a dream of light. From the back room came a voice, soft, measured. We're not open yet, but if you're needing candles for Christmas service, I'll have them ready by evening. Mornin', Mrs. Rowan, he said. There was a pause, then she appeared, wiping her hands on her apron, her hair pinned simply, a faint smudge of wax on her cheek. Her eyes met his and flickered with surprise. Sheriff Harper, she said quietly. What brings you out in this weather? He looked around the shop. You keep busy. It helps, he nodded toward the shelves. You been the one supplying those little gifts folks have been finding? Her hands stilled. Gifts? He studied her face, calm, composed, unrateable. Someone's been leaving them around town. Toys, food, a few candles. She looked away, adjusting a wick that didn't need adjusting. That sounds like kindness. We could use a bit of that. Could be theft, too, if the goods were taken. Her gaze lifted back to his, clear, steady. And what if they weren't? Then I suppose it's charity. Then maybe, she said softly, it doesn't need questioning. Daniel's jaw tightened. She was right, but the law didn't bend for good intentions. He gave a polite nod. If you hear or see anything, let me know. I always do, she replied. He turned to go, but something in her tone made him glance back. She was watching the candle flame nearest her, her expression tender, almost mournful. Outside, the snow had started again, falling heavier this time. He pulled his coat close and walked back toward his office, the little wooden horse still waiting on his desk. Behind him, in the shop, Maggie Rowan reached into her apron pocket and drew out a small folded note. In careful script it read, For Sammy Harper, may your Christmas light never go out. She pressed it against her chest for a moment before tucking it into a basket of finished candles, ready for the night's deliveries. Maggie Rowan's hands were steady, though her heart never was. Every evening since the snows began, she lit exactly 7 candles, one for each soul lost in the Silverleaf mine collapse last winter. Her husband, Patrick Rowan, had been the last name read aloud at the service. The others had families who'd left town since then, taking their sorrow somewhere warmer. Maggie had stayed. The light filled her small workshop, bouncing off brass molds and glass jars of dyes, warming the scent of beeswax and pine resin. It was her chapel now, the place where she prayed without words. She worked slowly, cutting thin ribbons of gold leaf to edge the base of a new candle. Its wax was pale, almost translucent, like snow pressed beneath sunlight. This one wasn't for the church. It was meant for the orphanage, where Miss Clara Boone kept 3 hungry mouths fed on miracles and stubbornness. Her hands trembled once, and she paused, whispering a line from memory. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Then she smiled faintly, a habit she'd developed when speaking to the empty air. You'd laugh at me for preaching to wax, Patrick, but I reckon heaven hears soft voices best. A soft meow answered her from the corner. Her cat, Ginger, lifted her head from a basket of wool blinking in the candlelight. Don't you start with me, too, Maggie said, half laughing. I'm not losing my wits. Not yet. But even as she spoke, she glanced at the door. The night outside pressed close against the windows. It wasn't the darkness she feared, but the thought of what it might be hiding or remembering. Silverleaf was a town that carried whispers like wind. Folks said she'd gone strange since her husband died, that she kept to shadows, that she'd been seen out at the graveyard after midnight. None of them knew why. She reached under the workbench and pulled out a small wooden crate, its lid tied shut with string. Inside lay a collection of trinkets, toys, candles, small loaves of bread wrapped in paper. Each one bore a name written carefully on brown tags. Children, widows, miners' families. Her angel box, Clara Boone had once called it, though Maggie had never claimed the title. She lifted one candle from the crate, slender, white, and etched with a tiny cross near the base. On its tag was written, Sheriff Daniel Harper, for the courage to see light again. She hesitated, tracing the letters with her thumb. Daniel had once been Patrick's closest friend, though they'd barely spoken since the collapse. He'd been the one to tell her the mine entrance had caved in. He'd stood at her porch with ash still clinging to his coat, his eyes hollow as the shaft itself. Since then, he'd carried his guilt like a second badge. She could see it in his shoulders when he walked down the street. Maggie set the candle gently aside. "You can't keep saving everyone," she whispered to herself, though part of her knew she was still trying. The clock struck 9. She bundled herself in her old wool shawl, tucked the crate under her arm, and opened the back door. The cold met her like a wall. Sharp, biting, clean. Snowflakes caught in her hair, and the hem of her skirt darkened as she stepped into the drifts. Her route was quiet and practiced. The orphanage first, then the empty miners' cottages, and finally the sheriff's office. Her boots left narrow trails between the houses. The only sounds were the crunch of snow and her own heartbeat. At Clara Boone's porch, she set down a loaf of bread and 3 candles, whispering a prayer for warmth. At the corner of Main Street, she paused. The light in the sheriff's office still burned. Through the frosted window, she saw Daniel seated at his desk, hat off, head bowed over the small carved horse. He looked like a man who hadn't learned how to rest. Her breath fogged the glass. For a moment, she almost tapped, almost let him see her there. Instead, she placed the candle on the windowsill, wrapped in brown paper. She lingered 1 second longer than she meant to, then turned back into the snow. Behind her, the lamplight flickered, and Daniel Harper looked up suddenly, as though he'd felt a presence. He rose, crossed the room, and opened the door to the night. Nothing but wind. But at his feet lay the package, warm from her hands. He bent, unwrapped it, and saw the candle inside. Plain but perfect, the gold leaf glinting faintly in the light. He whispered to himself, the angel again. Then he noticed the tag. He frowned, tracing the name written there. His own. The candle burned on Daniel's desk long after the fire in the stove died to embers. He'd sat there for hours, chin resting on his hand, watching the flames sway and breathe like something alive. Its light filled every dark corner of his small office, and with it came a scent he couldn't quite place. Beeswax, yes, but something else, something softer. Maybe rosemary, or pine, or memory. The tag with his name still lay beside it. He'd turned it over more than once, hoping for a clue. But there was only his name in that careful hand, small, neat, unmistakably feminine. He didn't know why it unsettled him so much. Maybe because no one had written his name like that in years. A knock came at the door. He straightened, voice low. "Come in." Clara Boone stepped inside, stamping snow from her boots like her gray hair tucked beneath a faded bonnet. "Sheriff Harper," she said briskly, "you look like a man who's seen a ghost." "Just firelight," he murmured, "and too much coffee." Her sharp eyes went to the candle. "Ah, so she's found you too." He looked up. "You sound sure of who she is." Clara shut the door behind her, leaning against it with a sigh. "I'm not sure of much these days, except that the good Lord uses strange messengers. That woman's been at it for weeks." Daniel studied her. "You mean Maggie Rowan?" Clara's silence was answer enough. "I asked her yesterday," he said. She denied it. Clara's mouth twitched into something between a smile and a frown. "Of course she did. The kindest hearts hide quickest, Sheriff. She's not looking for thanks. She's trying to atone." "Atone?" His tone sharpened. "For what?" "For surviving," Clara said simply. "You should know how that feels." Daniel's jaw set. The truth of it stung. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded. "She's breaking the law, Clara, if she's taken supplies from the mercantile or the church pantry." "She isn't," Clara cut in. "She buys every loaf she gives away, every toy, every candle. Don't you see? She's keeping this town alive while the rest of us just keep breathing." He stared at the flame, silent. Clara's voice softened. "Don't mistake her mercy for madness, Daniel. Not everyone who grieves is broken. Some just love louder than the world can stand." With that, she turned and let herself out, leaving a swirl of cold air in her wake. He sat there, staring at the door long after it closed. The candle crackled faintly, and for an instant it seemed to whisper her name, Maggie. He pushed back his chair, grabbed his coat, and stepped out into the snow. The night had grown fierce again, the wind cutting through the empty streets. But Daniel didn't turn back. His boots carried him toward Rowan's candle shop and, guided by the faintest glow behind frosted glass, he hesitated before knocking, not as a sheriff, but as a man uncertain what he wanted to find. The door opened before he could lift his hand. Maggie stood there in her shawl, one candle still burning behind her on the counter. Her eyes widened slightly. Sheriff Harper. He took off his hat, snow sliding from the brim. Evening, Mrs. Rowan. Her lips curved faintly. You look cold. I've been colder. They stood for a moment to pat the air between them, heavy with unspoken things, loss, memory, questions neither had dared voice. Finally, he said, You left something at my office. I leave a lot of things in this town, she replied softly. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You don't have to lie to me. I'm not here to make trouble. Her gaze didn't waver. Then why are you here, Sheriff? He hesitated, searching her face. Because I wanted to thank you. And because I wanted to understand. Understand what? How you can still believe in light after everything. Maggie's eyes glistened. Not tears, not yet. Just the shimmer of someone holding them back. I don't always, she said. Some nights I just make the candles and pray they'll burn long enough for somebody else to believe. Silence filled the room, soft and warm as the flame between them. Daniel's throat tightened. You should be careful. Folks talk. They always have, she said with a small, weary smile. But talk never kept anyone warm. He almost smiled back. You're not what I expected. No one is, Sheriff, she murmured, least of all the ones who've been broken. For a long heartbeat, he just stood there, hat in hand, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. Then he nodded, almost to himself. Good night, Mrs. Rowan. Good night, Sheriff. As he stepped back into the snow, she watched him go until he disappeared into the white. Then, quietly, she blew out the candle. Morning broke pale and slow over Silverleaf. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving a crystalline hush that felt too fragile to disturb. Sheriff Daniel Harper didn't sleep much that night. The candle she'd given him had burned itself out on his desk, but its scent, faint pine and honey, still lingered, as if refusing to leave. He told himself he wouldn't go back to see her, that a man had no business calling on a widow whose grief was still raw. But as he stepped into the street that morning, his boots somehow turned toward Rowan's candle shop again. Maybe it was duty. Maybe it was something else entirely. Inside the shop, Maggie Rowan was rearranging the window display, small white tapers clustered like a choir, each tied with ribbon. She didn't notice him at first. The morning light through the frosted panes gave her hair a halo glow, and she was humming under her breath something tender and half-forgotten. When the doorbell chimed, she started, turning quickly. Sheriff Harper, she said, her hand at her throat, you do have a way of appearing out of the snow. I suppose I do, he said, removing his hat. Didn't mean to startle you. You didn't. A pause. Much. He glanced toward the shelves. Busy morning? Busier than it looks, she said lightly. Christmas does that to people, makes them want light, even when they've forgotten why. He studied her a moment, noticing the small smudge of wax on her wrist, the careful way she handled each candle as though it were something living. I wanted to return this, he said, placing the candle's brass holder on the counter. She looked at it, then at him. You could have kept it. It didn't seem right, he said quietly. You paid for it. I didn't. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. Some debts aren't meant to be repaid, Sheriff. He hesitated. Maybe not, but maybe they can be shared. She tilted her head. Shared? I've been thinking, he said, leaning a hand on the counter. You've been going out in the night, leaving gifts. That's kind, but dangerous. The snow hides more than just tracks. There's still folks around here who'd take what isn't theirs, and worse. Her expression didn't change. You'd have me stop? He shook his head. No, I'd have you let me help. The silence that followed wasn't cold, it was surprised. She blinked at him, unsure if he was teasing. Help, she repeated softly. You? He smiled, the kind that looked as if it hadn't been used in a long while. I've been told I clean up well when there's no gunfire. She laughed then, a low, warm sound that seemed to lift some invisible weight between them. All right, she said at last. If you're truly of a mind to, come by after dark. There's more to carry than I can manage alone. He nodded, tipping his hat. I'll be here. As he turned to go, she called after him. Sheriff. He paused in the doorway. Her eyes softened. Thank you. He gave a small nod. For what? for remembering there's still good worth doing. He stepped out into the cold, heart unsteady. He hadn't realized until that moment how long it had been since someone had spoken to him like that, as if he were still capable of goodness. That evening, the town lay silvered in moonlight. Daniel stood in the alley behind the candle shop, collar turned up against the chill, his breath white in the dark. The back door creaked open and Maggie appeared, a woolen shawl around her shoulders, her arms full of small brown parcels. "You came," she said, voice soft. "I said I would." "Most folks say a lot of things," she murmured. He took half the load from her arms, like careful not to crush the wax within. "Where to first?" "The orphanage, then the miners' cottages." They moved through the sleeping streets in silence, their boots crunching side by side. Once their shoulders brushed and neither spoke of it. At the orphanage, she left a candle and a tin of cookies on the doorstep, whispering something he couldn't quite hear, a prayer or a wish. At the next stop, a sick miner's shack, she tucked a loaf of bread beneath the door. Each act was quiet, had reverent, almost holy. Daniel found himself watching her more than the road. The way her breath caught when she smiled, the care with which she handled even the smallest gift, the flicker of peace in her eyes each time she walked away from a door. By the time they reached the last cottage, the world had gone utterly still. Maggie stood for a moment, gazing up at the stars through the falling snow. "Patrick used to say the stars were holes in heaven," she whispered. "Where the light spills through." Daniel's voice was low. "He was a wise man." "He was," she said, "and stubborn. You two had that in common." He smiled faintly. "I'll take that as a compliment." "You should." The snow swirled between them. For a heartbeat, the night felt fragile, as if one word too loud might shatter it. Then she said softly, "You don't have to walk me back." "I know," he replied, "but I want to." And for once, she didn't argue. They walked together through the hush of falling snow, two shadows moving toward the small golden glow of the candle shop, the only light still burning in Silverleaf. By the next morning, the first whispers had already begun to stir. It didn't take much in Silverleaf. One candle seen burning too late, one sheriff seen walking a widow home, and the town's imagination did the rest. Clara Boone heard it first at the general store. Mrs. Cartwright, who'd come in for sugar, leaned close to the counter and murmured, "You seen Harper and Mrs. Rowan last night? Out past midnight, they say. Together." Clara only raised a brow. "I didn't know Christian Charity kept office hours." Mrs. Cartwright huffed. "It ain't charity when a woman's got a man with her in the snow." "Then perhaps you should try it sometime," Clara said coolly, reaching for her flower. By noon, the gossip had reached the saloon, the church steps, and the post office. Even the blacksmith grinned when Daniel walked past, nodding toward the candle shop. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He wasn't ashamed, only angry that kindness in this town had to wear disguises. That evening, when he reached the candle shop, Maggie was waiting. The moment she saw his face, she knew. "They've started talking, haven't they?" she asked softly. He nodded. "They have. And I told them they could say what they pleased. The truth don't change for the sake of rumor." Her eyes softened. "You shouldn't have to defend me, Sheriff." He met her gaze steadily. "Maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm defending the first good thing I've seen in a long time." The words surprised them both. Maggie looked away, color rising in her cheeks. "Be careful, Daniel. I've seen what this town does to good things." "I've seen what happens when folks stop trying for 'em," he said. The silence that followed was full, not awkward, but heavy with something new, something alive. Before either could speak again, a sound from outside shattered it, the crunch of hurried boots in snow. Daniel turned sharply. "Stay here." He stepped into the street, hand near his holster. Through the swirling flakes, a figure stumbled toward him. George Miller, the young deputy, breathless and pale. "Sheriff!" George gasped. "The storehouse by the rail yard. Someone broke in." Daniel's expression hardened. "When?" "Just now, Hal. I saw a lantern light and tracks leading toward the river." He nodded once. "Get the horses ready." When he turned back, Maggie stood in the doorway, shawl drawn tight, worry in her eyes. "Be careful," she said quietly. He gave her a faint, grim smile. "You too, Mrs. Rowan." Then he was gone, swallowed by the storm. The tracks were half covered already, but Daniel knew the land too well to lose them. He followed the lantern light through the trees, his breath clouding the air, boots sinking deep into drifts. At the bend of the frozen river, he saw movement, a figure darting toward the bridge. He called out, "Stop where you are." The man turned, thin, desperate, clutching a burlap sack. Daniel recognized him instantly. Alfred Pike, one of the old miners, half crippled from the collapse, a man who'd lost everything. "Put it down, Alfred," Daniel said, voice steady. "I ain't stealing for greed," Alfred shouted back. "There's kids hungry downriver. Ain't right for food to rot in that storehouse while they starve." Daniel's grip tightened on his revolver, though he didn't raise it. "You should have come to me." "You'd have said no. Law don't feed bellies." Daniel's heart twisted. "You're right, but mercy can." Alfred hesitated, just long enough for his foot to slip on the ice. The sack tore open, spilling dried beans and flour into the snow. He fell to his knees, sobbing. Daniel holstered the gun and stepped forward, kneeling beside him. "Come on, old friend. Let's get you warm." By the time they reached town, dawn was breaking. Maggie waited by the sheriff's office, her shawl dusted with frost. She didn't speak when Daniel led Alfred inside, only helped him sit by the stove and handed him a cup of coffee. The sheriff poured another cup for himself, his hands shaking slightly from cold. Alfred looked up, ashamed. "You'll have to lock me up, Sheriff." Daniel glanced toward Maggie, who only shook her head gently. "No," Daniel said. "Not tonight. We'll talk to the church, see what can be spared." Alfred blinked, disbelief mixing with gratitude. "Why?" Daniel's answer was simple, because a man shouldn't have to steal for kindness. Maggie met his eyes then, and something passed between them, unspoken but unmistakable. For the first time since Patrick's death, she felt something stir in her chest, fragile, terrifying, warm. That evening, as the last light of day faded, she lit another candle. One not meant for giving, but for keeping. It burned steady in her window, facing the sheriff's office across the street. And when Daniel looked up from his desk, he saw it there, her quiet signal in the snow. He smiled slow and faint, the way a man smiles when he remembers what hope feels like. The wind began its long howl just after dusk. By the time the lamps were lit, the blizzard had already swallowed Silverleaf whole. The streets vanished beneath drifts, the sky turned to white fire, and the church bell rang once, a hollow sound carried off by the wind. The townsfolk shuttered their windows and huddled near their stoves, whispering prayers that the roofs would hold and the cold would not find them. In the sheriff's office, Daniel Harper watched the storm through the frosted glass, the candle Maggie had given him flickering weakly on the desk. It was the only light left in the building. A knock sounded faintly through the roar of the wind. He opened the door, expecting his deputy or Clara Boone. But it was Maggie Rowan, her shawl heavy with snow, her cheeks red from the cold. "Mrs. Rowan," he exclaimed, "you shouldn't be out in this." She stepped inside, breathless. The roof started leaking, and the wind near tore the shutters off. "I couldn't stay." He shut the door hard behind her. "You'll stay here tonight. No argument." Her eyes softened, gratitude flickering behind fatigue. "I didn't plan to argue." He took her shawl, hung it by the stove, and handed her a cup of coffee. For a long while they simply sat, two souls enclosed in a small circle of warmth while the storm clawed at the windows. Outside, the world howled. Inside, silence settled slow and deep. Maggie watched the candle's flame dance. "You still kept it," she said softly. "I couldn't put it out," he replied. "Not sure I wanted to." Her lips curved faintly. "You talk like a man who's forgotten how." He gave a quiet laugh. "Maybe I'm remembering." The storm surged, rattling the walls. Daniel stood to check the window, but something slipped loose from between the ledgers on his desk. A folded envelope, yellowed with age. It landed near Maggie's feet. She bent to pick it up, her eyes catching the faded name written across the front. "To Sheriff Daniel Harper, from Patrick Rowan." Her breath caught. The room seemed to tilt around her. Daniel froze. "You recognize the handwriting?" "Yes," she whispered. "I'd know it anywhere." He took the letter gently from her hands, his jaw tight. "I never opened it. It was found in the rubble after the collapse. I thought it didn't seem right to read a dying man's words meant for me." Her eyes glistened. "You should read it now." He hesitated, then broke the seal. The paper crackled as he unfolded it. His voice was low, rough as he read aloud. "Daniel, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it out. I reckon you'll take the blame. You always do. But don't. I knew the risk, same as the rest. You weren't God. You were just the man who cared enough to count heads. If Maggie asks, tell her I was thinking of her when the light went. I could almost see her standing in that shop with her hands in wax and her heart on fire. Tell her to keep lighting the candles. They'll outlast the dark. And Daniel, don't let guilt keep you from living. She'll need someone with a steady hand, and I trust yours more than my own. Your friend. Always Patrick. When he finished, silence filled the room. The storm outside had softened to a low, mournful wind. Maggie's tears fell quietly onto her folded hands. He knew you'd blame yourself. I did, Daniel murmured. Still do. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. Then stop. He wouldn't want that. He looked at her, really looked, and something unspoken passed between them. Grief and grace mingled like candlelight and shadow. Her voice trembled. I used to think if I kept the light burning, he'd find his way back. Maybe that was foolish. Daniel shook his head. Maybe it was faith. For a moment, neither spoke. The world outside was all snow and wind. The world inside was still, glowing, tender. Then the lamp flickered, went out, leaving only the small candle between them. Its light wavered once, then steadied, strong against the dark. Maggie's hand lingered over his. Looks like the Lord gives us enough light for just the next step, she said softly. He smiled faintly. Then we'll take the next step. And for the first time that winter, the storm didn't feel so cold. Morning came slow to Silverleaf. The storm had passed, but its mark remained. Drifts piled high against fences, roofs sagging under the weight, and a silence so deep it seemed the world had forgotten how to breathe. The church bell never rang. The rope had frozen stiff, heavy with ice. Sheriff Daniel Harper stood outside the jailhouse with a shovel in his hands and Maggie Rowan beside him, her hair loose under her shawl. Together they dug a path through the snow, the sound of metal scraping against ice the only thing stirring the air. When they reached the street, the town began to emerge, a few figures moving slow through the cold, smoke rising from stoves, the faint cry of a child somewhere in the distance. Life was returning, quiet and stubborn. Maggie stopped, her breath fogging. Listen, she whispered. He paused, head tilted. From far off, soft but certain, came the sound of singing, children's voices. They followed the sound through the drifted street until they reached the old boarding house. A group of townsfolk stood gathered in front, Clara Boone, Reverend Markham, and half a dozen others, faces pale but smiling. The children were singing Silent Night. Their voices wavered in the cold, thin but bright, like the light breaking through cloud. Reverend Markham looked up as Daniel and Maggie approached. Sheriff, Mrs. Rowan, we thought we'd lost the roof last night, but she held fast. Seems the Lord wanted Christmas to come after all. Maggie smiled faintly. Looks that way. The Reverend nodded toward her. We were hoping you'd light the first candle at the church this morning. The bell's frozen, but the people came anyway. Her eyes widened. Me? You're the one who's kept the light burning all year. Seems only right. Daniel glanced at her, a small, proud smile hidden behind his collar. He's right, Maggie. She hesitated, then nodded, voice soft. Then I'll do it. The crowd made its way toward the small white church at the end of the street, snow creaking beneath boots, breath rising in clouds. Daniel fell into step beside her. Inside, the pews were cold, the candles unlit, but the air felt alive. The scent of pine and wax mingled with something else, hope, fragile and bright. Reverend Markham handed Maggie a taper. For Patrick, he said gently, and for all we've lost. She struck the match, her fingers trembling. The flame caught, steady and golden, and as she touched it to the wick of the first candle, light bloomed across the altar, one flicker sparking another. Soon the church glowed with dozens of tiny flames, a sea of quiet warmth chasing back the shadows. Maggie bowed her head, whispering, "Thank you." Daniel stood near the back, hat in hand, the light reflecting in his eyes. He felt something shift, not erasing the pain, but softening it, like snow melting under dawn. When the hymn began, he joined in. His voice was low and rough, but steady. Outside, the wind eased. A single ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, touching the bell tower. The frost began to melt, and the bell, frozen, silent through the storm, gave one clear, pure chime. The sound carried over the town, ringing through the valley like a promise kept. Maggie looked toward the sound, a smile rising slow and sure. He heard us, she whispered. Daniel met her gaze. Maybe he never stopped. They stood there side by side as the light grew stronger. The first Christmas morning Silverleaf had known in years, and for the first time in a long time, The bells did not sound like mourning. They sounded like mercy. By afternoon, the sun shone clear and white over Silverleaf, glinting off the mounds of snow like fields of glass. The storm had swept the sky clean. So clean it hurt to look at. Men were out repairing fences, women shoveling paths, children laughing as they rolled snowballs nearly as tall as themselves. The church bell rang every hour now, not for warning, but for gratitude. Sheriff Daniel Harper had spent the morning helping dig out the old schoolhouse roof, and now he walked down Main Street with Maggie Rowan at his side. Her cheeks were still red from the cold, her shawl dusted with frost, but her eyes were light again. They paused outside the Mercantile, where Sammy Harper, Daniel's nephew, was busy scraping snow away from the steps with a broken-handled shovel. "Uncle Daniel," he called, "come look what I found!" He held up a small, snow-caked box tied with twine. The corners were worn, but on the top was carved a familiar mark, a tiny angel with outstretched wings. Maggie drew in a breath. "That's the same carving as the toys." Daniel took the box gently from the boy. "Where'd you find it?" "Buried right under the steps," Sammy said. "I think the angel left it." Daniel brushed off the snow, fingers tracing the carving. The box was old, older than the boy could guess. The wood was dark and smooth from handling, the hinges rusted. He opened it slowly. Inside lay a small folded paper and a single silver locket, tarnished with age. Maggie reached for it, her hand trembling. "I know this," she whispered. When she opened the locket, two faces smiled back, Patrick Rowan on one side, and on the other, a younger Maggie, her hair braided, her smile shy. The note inside was written in a careful hand. "For Maggie, if ever this light fades, let another carry it. There's more than one kind of angel in Silverleaf." Her eyes filled, but this time the tears were quiet, grateful. "He left it here, for me to find." Daniel folded the note and handed it to her. "Seems he meant for you to keep the light burning, one way or another." Sammy beamed. "Does that mean you're the Christmas angel, Miss Maggie?" She laughed softly, brushing his hair. "Oh, no, sweetheart. Angels don't wear shawls full of snow." Daniel smiled faintly. "Maybe they do." They stood there for a long moment, the three of them framed in sunlight, snow glinting around them like 1,000 tiny stars. Then Daniel spoke, low and steady. "We'll take it to the church. Let everyone see what mercy looks like when it takes its time." By evening, the townsfolk gathered again. The locket rested on the altar beside the candles, a quiet symbol of what they'd all lost and somehow found again. Reverend Markham spoke only one line before bowing his head. "Sometimes grace is buried right beneath our feet, waiting for us to stop running long enough to find it." As the people prayed, Daniel's gaze drifted to Maggie. She was kneeling, her face peaceful, the locket gleaming softly beside her hands. Outside, the snow began to fall again. Light this time, slow and calm, covering the earth like a blessing. Daniel closed his eyes and whispered a single word, one he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "Thank you." When he opened them, Maggie was looking back at him. And in that look, simple and unguarded, he saw what Patrick had meant. Mercy wasn't just in the forgiving. It was in the living, in the choosing to begin again. And so, with the snow falling gentle as breath and the bells ringing faint across the hills, Silverleaf learned that sometimes angels don't descend from the heavens. Sometimes they simply stay. The wind had quieted by evening, leaving the world blanketed in white. The storm's rage had passed, but in its wake, Silverleaf stood changed. Not broken, but softened. Inside the church, Clara Boone smiled through tears. "You gave us light when we'd forgotten we needed it." Her gaze moved slowly from one person to another. Men who'd once cursed her husband's name, women who'd whispered behind her back, children who'd called her the Candle Widow. Every one of them stood holding her work, little beacons of flame that shimmered like hope itself. Daniel knelt beside her. "You've got the whole town praying in your shop's wax, Maggie." She gave a faint smile. "I never meant for anyone to know." He looked around at the glowing faces. "Seems the Lord thought otherwise." A hush fell. The candles flickered. Maggie drew in a long, shaky breath. "I made them for the ones we lost," she said softly. "For Patrick, for the miners, for anyone who couldn't find their way home." Reverend Markham nodded, voice full of quiet awe. "And now you've helped us find ours." The people bowed their heads, not in mourning, but in reverence. It wasn't about forgiveness now, it was about remembering. Maggie reached for Daniel's hand. Do you think he'd be proud? He squeezed her fingers. I think he already is. The church was utterly silent except for the faint hiss of candle flames. One by one, the people began to hum a hymn, not loud, not perfect, but pure. And in that soft music, the grief that had haunted Silverleaf for years finally began to lift. The town, once divided by loss, was whole again, not because they had forgotten, but because they had remembered together. Christmas morning dawned still and pale, the snow glittering like glass across the hills. The air was crisp, and the sky above Silverleaf shone the faint blue of a promise kept. From the window of her candle shop, Maggie Rowan watched the lights spill over the valley. Smoke rose from every chimney. For the first time in years, the town had woken early, not for work, but for worship. She wrapped her shawl close, took the locket from its resting place by the window, and stepped out into the cold. Down the street, people were already gathering at the church. Clara Boone carried a tray of sweet rolls. Reverend Markham stood by the door, cheeks pink from the frost, smiling like a man who had seen a miracle and wasn't done believing. And standing near the gate, tall, steady, snow-dusted, was Sheriff Daniel Harper. He tipped his hat. "You look like you've been waiting on this morning a long while." "I think I have," she said, smiling faintly. "Feels like we all have." They entered the church together. The pews were full, the air warm with candlelight. Children clutched wax tapers Maggie had made. The scent of pine and melted honey filled the room. When the Reverend raised his hands, the murmurs stilled. "For years, this bell has stood silent," he said, voice strong and even. "We said it was broken, but maybe it was we who were." Maggie's eyes filled as he nodded toward her. "This morning, one among us reminded Silverleaf how to light the dark. Let the bell ring for all who found their way home." Daniel stepped forward, pulling the long rope that hung stiff with ice. The first tug gave nothing. The second, a low creak. And then, clang. A deep, clear tone rolled through the church, through the streets, across the snowy valley. Children gasped, women covered their mouths, men took off their hats and looked skyward. The bell rang again, louder this time, pure and golden, echoing through the mountains as if the world itself were waking up. Maggie bowed her head. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she smiled. He did hear us. Daniel looked toward her, his voice low. Seems he never stopped listening. The hymn began softly, "Joy to the world." And this time the singing was sure, full, unafraid. As the final note rose and fell, the bell gave one last slow toll, its sound drifting over the valley like a blessing. Outside, sunlight spilled through the clouds, touching every rooftop, every frozen tree, until the town glowed. A quiet miracle born of faith, sorrow, and one woman's stubborn light. Maggie turned to Daniel, the corners of her eyes glistening. "Maybe the Lord still works his wonders," she whispered. He smiled. "Maybe he just uses better hands these days." She laughed softly. "Yours or mine?" He looked at her a long moment. "Both." And for the first time, the silence in his chest eased. The bell kept ringing, clear and strong, and Silverleaf stood shining in its sound. 1 year later. The winter sun broke through the mountains like a soft golden ribbon, painting Silverleaf in light. The town was alive again, smoke curling from chimneys, laughter drifting through the cold, and bells ringing steady as a heartbeat. It was Christmas Eve. Down the lane by the church, Maggie Rowan's little candle shop glowed through the frost. The sign above the door read, "The Angel's Light, Candles and Keepsakes." Inside, the shelves were lined with carefully wrapped candles, some tall and white for Christmas, others tiny and carved in the shape of angels. A steady stream of townsfolk came and went, offering coins and smiles, but most came just to see her, the woman who had brought light back to Silverleaf. Near the window, a little girl pressed her nose to the glass, watching as Sheriff Daniel Harper knelt to light the candles on the sill. She giggled. "Mama says you keep the angels busy all year long, Mr. Harper." Daniel smiled at her. "Reckon they need a hand or two down here sometimes." The girl ran to her mother, her laughter spilling into the crisp air. Maggie stepped beside him, wiping her hands on her apron. Her hair, streaked with silver now, caught the candlelight. "You're good with children," she said quietly. He glanced toward the little girl. "Guess I've had some practice. Sammy's near grown now. He looks up to you. Maybe one day he'll look after this town better than I did." She shook her head. "You've done just fine." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the candles burn in the window. Snow began to fall again, slow, soft flakes that drifted down like blessings. Daniel turned to her. You still light one for Patrick every Christmas? I do, she said, touching the small silver locket that hung from her neck. But I light one for us too, for what came after. He nodded, his voice low. He'd want that. Outside, the church bell began to ring, strong and full, the same one that had once lain frozen. Its sound rolled over the town, mingling with the carolers' voices. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small carved figure, an angel, simple and rough-hewn, wings spread wide. Been working on this since spring, he said. Don't look near as fine as the ones you make. Maggie took it gently. It's beautiful, she whispered. You carved this? He nodded, almost shy. Figured every light needs a keeper. Her eyes softened. And every keeper needs someone to remind him he's not alone. He smiled. You do that well. Outside, children's laughter rang as they built snowmen along the lane. The bell tolled once more, bright and sure. Maggie looked out the window at the glowing town below. You know, she said softly, sometimes I still think I see him, just for a second, standing by the church door, smiling, like he's watching over all of us. Daniel's gaze followed hers. Maybe he is. The snow thickened, wrapping Silverleaf in white. Inside, the candles flickered golden and steady, their light reflecting in the window, hundreds of small flames mirrored against the snow. Maggie leaned her head gently against Daniel's shoulder. Do you think we'll ever stop lighting them? He wrapped his arm around her. Not while we've still got breath. She smiled, tears bright in her eyes. Then I reckon Silverleaf's light will never go out. And as the last bell faded across the valley, the town settled into quiet peace, no longer a place of ghosts, but of grace. Somewhere high in the hills, the wind whispered through the pines, soft, almost like a voice. Keep the light burning. And they did. Here on Wild Mercy, we don't just tell tales, we bring forgotten hearts back to life. Love that defies distance, war, and fate. Hit that like button to keep these stories riding strong. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss another heartfelt romance, a story of resilience, and where love always finds a way home.